Right, thank you very much for coming to this British Computer Society talk. It's my pleasure to welcome Martyn Thomas to Aberystwyth. Martyn is an honorary professor in the Department of Computer Science here. He's also used to be a visiting professor at Oxford and Bristol, and also at one time was director of the Serious Organised Crime Agency. He is now Vice President of the Royal Academy of Engineers and also Chair of the IT panel of the IET. And please welcome him to give his talk on the dilemmas of big data. As soon as I change the...
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for turning out on a cold January evening to come and listen to a talk and I hope share your opinions on some of the issues that we will be talking about. What I want to do is to provoke a discussion because I'm largely at a loss to know what the right policy responses are to many of the issues that are now being raised by the era of big data that we're moving into, that we have moved into. So I think this is a time when IT professionals need to be thinking hard about what they really feel they ought to be doing with the skills they've got, where society as a whole needs to engage in an informed debate about what sort of a future we want to be living in, where the people who've got IT skills need to help inform that debate, but in particular where we who are fortunate enough to live in the computing industry and therefore to be very familiar with the issues, listen a lot to what everybody else thinks about things, because we have too often been building the systems that we knew how to build because they looked like good fun or because they were a good way of making money. And I think not paying enough attention to what kind of society we're creating. So, as I say, what I'm hoping to do is to provoke a discussion. Let's see how I get on. I want to focus on personal data. Big data goes much wider than that. I mean, the Large Hadron Collider is generating petabytes of data that the physicists will be analysing and are analysing. That's an interesting topic, but it's not my topic for tonight. What I'm interested in is the data about people that is being generated and collected. And more of it is being generated. We are already in a situation where your supermarket probably knows you're pregnant before you do, because they know more about your buying habits than you can remember, and because their analysis enables them to predict things from your buying habits that you may not even have realised are causing you to buy things differently. And there have been some fairly embarrassing revelations that have come out as a consequence of them acting on that data, as you may have seen in press stories. We live in a world where Google knows almost everything about you. And how relaxed you feel about that depends a bit on how much you value personal data, personal privacy, how much you trust Google. Perhaps after the work of Mr. Snowden and the revelations, you trust them slightly less than you used to. That's perhaps another topic that we'll be coming back to. And in this era of more personal data being available, the benefits of analysing personal data are leading governments to release more data that is data about people. I mean, if you haven't already received one of these leaflets from the NHS, giving you the option of opting out of having your medical files uploaded from your GP and made available to researchers under particular conditions, If you haven't received one of these, you will, because they're going out to everybody in the country. It might be England. It might be England. It does say it's a national health service, but it's NHS England that's doing it. I'd be interested to know, perhaps when we get into a discussion session, what NHS Wales is doing about it, and whether there is a difference there that provides some insight into different attitudes between the different administrations. I will be talking quite a lot about the negative aspects of this explosion of analysis of data, but I want to make it clear there are major benefits. There are very good reasons for what's happening. Companies obviously make a huge amount of value out of processing data about their customers, about people that they hope will become their customers, about people's behaviour in general, and so on. There's a lot of commercial value there. There's a lot of benefit to individuals because you potentially get a much more personalised service by giving up data. And you get rewarded for giving up personal data because it's so valuable to the companies they're even prepared to bribe you with a fraction of the money that they will make from it to give it to them. Hence, reward cards and store loyalty cards and those sorts of bribes. And society can potentially get enormous value out of it in ways which we will discuss. But there are societal and individual risks of harm, and surprisingly little debate about the issues. It's very difficult to believe that anybody could really argue that people's decision as to whether to give up personal data, to act in a way that leads personal data to be collected when they could act in a way that would stop that happening, it's hard to argue that that is an informed decision in general. People are doing it, I think, without having enough information about exactly what the consequences might be. So I feel that this sort of meeting is important because it helps to create that informed debate, and it helps us to share knowledge and opinions. These are some of the benefits, some of the good things that come out of it. I mean, the reason why NHS England is collecting this data is because of the benefits of doing population scale medical research, of being able to do the analyses that will uncover some of the unexpected triggers for diseases, for people being particularly well or particularly ill, the things that actually affect people's well-being in all sorts of ways that are only revealed when you can do very wide statistical analyses with very rich data sets. I know from my time in soccer, in the Serious Organised Crime Agency, the benefits of doing this sort of analysis for the prevention and detection of crime. Lots of the data that is analysed, the phone data that is analysed, for example, enabling the identification of criminal behaviour, the collection of the suspicious activity reports that are made by all the financial institutions if they suspect that a financial transaction might just possibly reveal either criminal activity or money laundering, and which then get analysed. The way in which large amounts of the publicly available data sets are analysed, looking for evidence of criminal, perhaps even terrorist activity. Those sorts of things are certainly beneficial in society. They do have some negative aspects, and there is therefore a balance, but there are undoubtedly also some positive aspects, and that's the point I want to make. Where the balance between the positives and the negatives lies is essentially the subject for the evening. The analysis should enable government to produce better social policy, assuming that analysis is done correctly and that it really does inform social policy so that you get evidence-based policy. Too often what I actually see is policy-based evidence. It's people who come up with a policy and then go around looking for the data that will actually justify that policy. But in principle, at least, you would hope that in a modern society, a lot more of social policy would be based on proper analysis of the data that is available. And of course, the government has a huge amount of data about all of us because it needs it for administrative purposes. You need to analyse data for infrastructure planning. In order to find out, you need to know where people are travelling in order to know what you need to do about the transport infrastructure, for example, just as one example. And increasingly, certainly the UK government is arguing that the availability of large-scale data sets that could be made available for commercial purposes will stimulate economic growth, will stimulate inward investment because people will want to locate their companies places where they've got access to rich data that they can then exploit for commercial purposes. And one of the justifications for what NHS England is doing with the health data is trying to bring the pharmaceutical industry research labs back into the UK as they were starting to migrate away. That's why it's supported by the Wellcome Trust, for example, which sees the great potential of that and the stimulating effect that it could have on medical research and on economic growth in the UK. But it all comes with an increased threat to privacy. Does that matter? It's too often said that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And I want to argue that is a dreadful thing to say, that it's unthinking, that it's callous, and that it's ignorant. It's unthinking because data lasts a lifetime. Things that you did legally and honestly will stay around. The data that provides evidence of that will still be available long into the future. As a lot of young people are finding now when they discover that actually the reason they weren't invited for interview was because their employers routinely look at Facebook, for example. And they thought that if they deleted stuff from their Facebook pages, it would go away, not realising that a lot of people either copy stuff from Facebook pages and put it somewhere else, or even that the Wayback Machine and other internet archiving gives you access to pages that no longer exist in the live web. So even at that sort of level, there's sort of, normal teenage pranks almost can bite you later on. But you could imagine worse things happening. It's not out of the question that a future government might decide that people who hadn't looked after their health ought to be given lower priority in health treatment at public expense, or that even they ought to pay a contribution towards that treatment. And their purchasing history might very well be called upon as evidence that they weren't looking after themselves properly. That purchasing history is, of course, stored, will persist, is available, would be available were such a policy to be introduced. And it doesn't have to be likely for it to be a concern, it seems to me. And it's a particularly extreme and unfortunate example, but back in the 1930s in the Netherlands, it was decided that the national census would record religious affiliation. They stored their census on hollerith cards, on punched cards. And when the Netherlands was invaded, that census data was processed using Hollerith sorting machines, not even really computers, but the early punch card sorting machines to identify the Jewish population. And a lot of people died as a consequence of that information being held in the census. And the reason that it had been put in the census was wholly benign. It was because it was considered highly desirable that people who were terminally ill, perhaps as a result of an accident, were given the appropriate last rites by somebody from their religion. And that was the policy reason for incorporating it, and a future, as it turns out, invading government in this case, chose to use that information for other purposes. But there ought to be, perhaps, a sort of right to be able to free yourself from past actions, unless those past actions are actually criminal. And the things that you do reveal a lot about you. And the URL that I've quoted there is a report from a social psychologist in Cambridge, who working with the computing people in Cambridge, who has done an analysis and shown that to a reasonably high degree of accuracy and probability, just 4 ticking likes on Facebook reveals surprising amounts about your personality, your political leaning. And this was done in America, so it could distinguish between Democrats and Republicans, sexuality, and other personality traits, introvert, extrovert, for example, correlated quite well. And this wasn't likes of obvious things. It wasn't, somebody liking the Tea Party page and therefore obviously being identified as having that political leaning. This was people liking particular pop videos or liking particular artists. It was much more subtle. It's worth reading the paper, because it does show the extent to which surprising things can be teased out of the data that is held about you. So that's unthinking. That's unthinking. You do have something to fear, even if you don't have anything to hide at the moment, because you may decide in retrospect that actually you don't want somebody else acting on the data that you gave up thinking that it wouldn't matter. Because now they're inferring things from it and acting on that inference, which you'd really rather they weren't doing. So, unthinking, I think I can justify unthinking. Then there's callous. There's a sort of implication in the mantra that if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, that there's something wrong in having something to hide, that a desire for personal privacy somehow has a negative connotation. It's not... People don't stand up politically and say, well, we've all got things to hide, and therefore we've all got things to fear. It's always, well, there's some people who've got things to hide, but we don't really need to worry about them, because they shouldn't have things to hide. But all these sorts of things are entirely legitimate, strong reasons why you may want to conceal things about your personal life. Many people will suffer from medical conditions that can very easily attract prejudice. The obvious ones are things like HIV status or mental illness, both of which quite unreasonably attract prejudice, but nevertheless do attract prejudice, and people, I think, entirely legitimately may choose not to reveal such episodes about themselves. There are intensely personal things, past traumas that you've had in your life that are just completely personal, and there's no reason why anybody else should ever know that about you. There are people, unfortunately, very many people escaping abusive relationships who need to be able to hide their current location and the location of their children from an abusive partner who may wish them considerable harm. And we see injuries and murders regularly in the newspapers from estranged partners who have been abusing their partner and have then followed them after they've escaped from the relationship and perhaps taken the children with them. There's religious bias. Still, unfortunately, quite a lot of religious prejudices around. And I mean, we saw just last week that it was considered sufficiently dangerous for an Afghanistani Muslim who had become an atheist to return to Afghanistan that they were given asylum in the UK, which with some level of official recognition that there is enough prejudice against somebody with that particular religious background and persuasion that there was a threat to their life, at least in Afghanistan, and therefore potentially also in the UK at a different level. There's people who are protecting the identity and location of children they've adopted. These days, children don't generally get into a position where they need to be adopted unless they have had a very troubled background, and quite often that means that the birth parents or the family of the birth parents have reasons that they want to contact these children, and there are societal barriers to them doing that, they should only be able to do it through social services, they should be counselled about the impact that it would have, it should only be done with the permission of the child when the child is old enough to give that permission, and so on. Those mechanisms, those processes, those barriers have been put in place for good reasons because of the experience that has been had of unmediated interaction between birth parents and adopted children. And therefore it is entirely reasonable that the parents of adopted children would want to maintain those barriers and ensure the safety and security of the children they've adopted. There are things in the legal system like witness protection where people need to be given new identities, and those identities need to be protected because they are at very serious risk of harm from the people against whom they've given evidence, for example, who are in quite often extremely nasty people, as I know from my time in soccer. And there are many more instances like this where people have a very, very compelling reason to need to be able to protect their personal privacy. And a decent society looks after vulnerable people. We don't just say, it doesn't affect us and therefore we don't care what happens to you because you happen to be in this unfortunately vulnerable position. A decent society, I would argue, provides a framework where people can protect their privacy without looking so unusual that actually it has a reverse effect and draws attention to them. So you need it to be possible for people to preserve their privacy without standing out in the general crowd. And it's ignorant because there is this common statement that you don't need to worry because the data is anonymised. Yes, it's personal data. It's data that refers to the details of one individual. It hasn't been aggregated in the way that the old census data used to be aggregated and seeded to make sure that you couldn't identify individuals within it. It's been anonymised. Well, anonymisation isn't possible for personal data. The computer scientists have worked very hard to find ways of de-anonymising anonymous data for all kinds of reasons, because deep data analysis is a fascinating subject and extremely commercially valuable. And one of the consequences of being able to do sophisticated data analysis is that you are able to find matches between different data sets which can be applied to personal data to re-identify anonymised personal data. And it's remarkably easy to do with a remarkably high success rate. You can't guarantee always that you'll be able to find the individual, but you can uncover enough of them that for any individual it's a significant risk if people are doing that analysis. And increasingly they will be and are, because there's a commercial value in it. And there have been, again, some particularly entertaining examples of that. There was a mayor of a city in America who announced that it was impossible to identify the individuals in the anonymised medical data that he was releasing, and 2 days later he was posted his medical records from the data that had been released. It's almost as amusing as Jeremy Clarkson revealing his bank details on television, arguing that nobody could possibly use them in any nefarious way, and to find himself signed up to several charities that he didn't agree with. But so when you're releasing personal data, it really is likely that it is going to be possible to re-identify it, maybe even trivially easily. And medical data, if you're going to do a decent analysis of society-wide medical data, you need to know quite a lot about people. You need to know their age, their gender, where they live, so that you can look for clusters of particular conditions around a power station, or clustering around electricity pylons, or in particular geographic areas where you're not sure what the factor is, but nevertheless there's a cluster here, and therefore you're looking for the factor in order that you can try and identify it. And it doesn't take much, actually. I mean, if you actually know somebody's postcode and their gender and how many children they've got and their age, you can almost certainly identify them just from that. If you've actually got access to another set of databases, and there are many publicly available databases, even something like the Twitter feed would probably give you a lot of data that would enable you to do this, then you don't even need something as specific as the actual postcode. Something much broader than that would give you the ability to identify the individual. So I'm thinking callous and ignorant. I really, really want to push back against this notion that if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. This is an issue that it is worth us all personally understanding and taking decisions about what we want to reveal about ourselves, and what it's worth to us, what the trade-off is worth in terms of added convenience for giving up personal data or whatever. Otherwise, things like this programme can't be ethically justified, because it won't be an informed decision that people take as to whether they should opt out or not. And then there's the issue of oversight. The way in which personal data is handled in the UK is probably, in my opinion, it is not adequately controlled and supervised. The Data Protection Act, well-meaning though it is, doesn't properly implement the European Data Protection Directive in one key way, in that its definition of personal data says that it is data which identifies an individual either on the face of the data itself or in combination with other data in the possession of the data controller. And that's not the issue. It's whether it's data that could identify an individual person by using data that is reasonably available to anyone who might get access to that data, not just the limited data that is actually in the possession of the data controller. And the European Data Directive doesn't make that distinction. The European Data Directive talks about other available data, doesn't limit it to data that is actually in the possession of the data controller. What that actually means is that quite a lot of the systems that are currently employed in the UK in government departments are probably illegal under European law. There was a database state report produced by the Foundation for Information Policy Research and Privacy International about 8 years ago now, I think. It's on the FIPR website, on the FIPR website, fipr.org, which went through the main government databases that were around and classified them as to whether they looked as though they were legal or not. And many of them were, very much on the cusp of not being legal, and one or two of them were clearly illegal under European law, according to the lawyers who were advising FIPR. And that's a danger to us as a society, because it means that at some point in the future, somebody may raise a legal challenge over that, and it may actually cause a great deal of expense as we have to dismantle some government process that depends on a database which has now been found not to be lawful, and when they then have to compensate a large number of people, perhaps as a consequence of that. So doing things within the law is always a smart move, and not getting too close to the edges of legal definitions is a smart move. But beyond the deficiencies in the Data Protection Act, the level of enforcement by the Information Commissioner's Office is actually pretty feeble. I mean, it's getting better to a degree, but for years they haven't had enough technical expertise. They're certainly grossly under-resourced. And as a consequence, it's very difficult for them to do anything other than pursue the most egregious transgressions of the Data Protection Act. And in addition to that, the government has refused to introduce sensible penalties. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been following the bit of theatre that's been going on in the Home Affairs Select Committee over the past few months, where Keith Vaz and his committee have been arguing that the law enforcement agencies, including SOCA, ought to release in public a list of people and organisations that have been employing private detectives in order to get, employing private detectives who in other court cases have been discovered to be using illegal means to get access to private data. And the underlying motivation appears to be, the press are very much behind the Home Affairs Select Committee in this action, and the underlying motivation appears to be that there is a feeling that in some way the law enforcement agencies have been going after journalists who've been using private investigators to get personal data, but haven't been being even-handed and haven't been going after firms of solicitors and financial services companies that have been doing the same thing, and that's not fair. And of course, this is all against the background of the Leveson report and what might come out of the Leveson report, and just exactly how regulation will be imposed, and so there's quite a political backstory to what's going on there. But the Information Commissioner has been giving evidence to the Select Committee and has been arguing very strongly that if there have been data protection transgressions in the cases that the committee is worried about, then they're only transgressions against Schedule 55 of the Act. And those transgressions are typically punished in a magistrate's court with a fine of about £50. And that therefore, if the law enforcement agencies were to proceed with this, the most that the penalty would be likely to be would be a £50 fine. There is on the statute book penalties, including imprisonment, for transgressions of Schedule 55 of the Act. But the government has not brought that into force. It's been passed into law, but it hasn't been commenced. Despite the fact that the Home Affairs Select Committee has argued strongly that it should be, the Information Commissioner has argued strongly that it could be, and there have been debates in Parliament arguing that it should be, nevertheless, governments have decided that they're not actually going to bring that into force. So there aren't strong penalties for people breaking the Data Protection Act. Just fines that are really don't warrant the investment in bringing prosecutions. And then there's Snowden. And the Snowden revelations, I think, have taken everybody by surprise. But the people that shouldn't have been taken by surprise are the Cabinet and the National Security Council and Parliament, all of whom seem to have been wrong-footed by what has been coming out in Der Spiegel, in The Guardian, and in the Washington Post in particular. And that suggests pretty strongly that the protections that society thought were in place to make sure that the checks and balances were working, that the things that the security services were doing had proper oversight, those checks and balances don't seem to have been being enforced or operating in the way that had been expected, because the people who ought to have known about what was going on seem not to have known about what was going on and therefore couldn't exercise them. There's, moving to a slightly different topic briefly, there's also another problem in the way in which big data is handled in government affairs, and that's that it's increasingly being used instead of doing properly controlled longitudinal studies in order to inform policy, and that creates a selection bias which is very difficult to overcome. If you rely on online data, then you miss the quarter of the population who just are not online. If you use NHS data, you miss the healthy to a very large extent. And you miss a lot of aspects of lifestyles, therefore, that contribute to medical outcomes, positive or negative. So you can get bad policy out of big data if you use it as a cheap way of getting the information that really, in order to be able to justify the actions you're taking, ought to be only based on properly controlled trials. So I've talked for long enough, I think. I want to hear what you think. I mean, how comfortable do you feel about the ways in which the collection and use of personal data are made at the moment? And if you feel uncomfortable about it, what can we do about it? What is the right way to balance the benefits to society, perhaps, against the risk to individuals? Because it tends to be that way around, that things are benefiting a large group or benefiting one group, but presenting a risk or some harm to another group. Is this something we can do in general, or do we need to treat each data set as a special case? And there's a consultation that's, I think, still open. Certainly it's very recent, and I think is still open, where the Nuffield Trust is inquiring about whether genomics data about people's genomes, is a special class of data that ought to be treated in a special way as having particular privacy implications. And of course the key thing about genomics data is that it's not just about you. I mean, your genomics data reveals a lot of information about anybody who's genetically related to you. And so if you give informed consent about that data being released perhaps into the public domain, you're actually also giving consent on behalf of everybody who's genetically related to you. And they haven't given informed consent in all probability, because you probably haven't gone around and asked them all. So Is it a class of data that deserves special treatment? Discuss and perhaps even contribute to the Nuffield consultation. And how would we enforce oversight mechanisms if we introduce them? What should we do? I think these are important questions, and I hope that I've said enough this evening to have convinced you that these are questions worth discussing and seeing if we can come up with answers to. But the floor is yours now, and I really look forward to hearing what people have to say. Yes?
Mine's a point of practicality. It just occurs to me, just to make sure you're aware, at this point the session is being recorded. That's my so before you suddenly answer, if we're going to get into some issues where people don't want this on the record, then maybe this is the appropriate moment to pause that recording discussion. But I'd rather that was in the open, so you knew that before.
Obviously, like, come and take a picture of everybody and put it on the internet.
Roger.
Is there a problem that when Parliament or whoever your legislature might be creates statute, that's a ponderous process? This is a good thing. If it's not a ponderous process, you wind up with bad statute. But the life cycle of the technological whiz-bangs that underpin a lot of what you're discussing and other things I can think of is much, much shorter. So any attempt to regulate, control, is always playing catch up.
It's certainly an issue, yeah, no doubt about that. I have a strong preference for coherence in legislation. It seems to me that ideally you want to draw general principles that you then apply as uniformly as you can. Otherwise you end up with a complete mishmash of legislation which is contradictory and doesn't seem to have any underlying coherence. So I'm always very keen that ideally we ought to draw out those principles, and I think it's worth drawing out principles in this area and then seeing whether actually those principles can be applied to new technology and new areas of activity as they emerge. My guess is in most cases it can. There's an awful lot of legislation around that has survived perfectly well. The legislation about identity theft, for example, it's impersonation is the underlying crime, and that is relying on statutes that go back a long way. And you don't really need new laws in order to be able to prosecute people for pretending to be somebody else and gaining financial benefit out of it. So, yeah, it's an issue, but I don't think it's a killer.
I couldn't agree more that it should be guided by principle. I just think that technology sometimes tests principle to very limited sometimes.
Yes, it does, but equally, I think certainly we in the technical community can see far enough ahead to be able to alert people to issues that are going to be arising. I mean, things like autonomous vehicles, for example. We can already tell you quite a lot of the legal issues that will come out of the increasing use of autonomous vehicles, and yet nobody that we can see in the legislature is engaging with that.
I can only really look at this from an intelligence kind of view. The problem with this is that any legislation we introduce is going to be applied on a national scale. But big data, as with any issues of who can access your data and what they can do with it, is an international problem. The internet is transnational. So any regulations we introduce are not going to apply to other countries. And any regulations we introduce are not going to apply to international corporations unless they're based in the United Kingdom or the United States and so forth. So how do we go about stopping other countries accessing that data? And how do we go about stopping other people using it? And just from that, it seems one of the problems that is always coming up in this subject, or if anything to do with how data is accessed, is naivety, in that people don't quite realise how vulnerable their data is and don't realise how to protect it. And at the start you asked, what should the IT community be doing? And maybe the IT community should be focusing on education and making people that are aware of what they can do to protect their data, which has happened since PRISM actually. There's been a lot of tools that have come out now to show how people can go online and be safe. Maybe that's something that we should be looking into on
Yeah, I agree with that. And go online and be safer, at least. I mean, let me rise to that challenge. Don't use Google as your search engine. Use Start Page, or the equivalent, which is Xquick, IX Quick. It uses Google. You get all the same search results, but it does it through a proxy server. It doesn't keep your IP address. There is no record in Google as to what you've been searching for. And it then returns you search results, which again you can access through the proxy server, so that Google doesn't know what you've actually been for, what links you've been following.
And what if the NSA is tapping that proxy?
It's based in Europe.
That doesn't stop them.
It doesn't stop them. It doesn't stop them, and it may very well be that they're actually getting a live data feed as a result of compromising that. But at least they're not getting access to a historical database.
It's just, I have noticed that young people from age about 14 upwards certainly create and maintain multiple identities, which may play merry hell with policy generation in the future, but that's what they're doing as a practical step.
Yes, and I would strongly encourage that. Indeed, I was on the expert group for the Identity and Passport Service when the ID cards were being proposed. And one of the proposals that I was putting forward was that the IPS actually ought to make it easy for people to obtain as many identities as they wanted. And maintain only for themselves a way of cross-correlating those identities, but to let people have passports in as many names as they wanted, ID cards as many names as they wanted, specifically in order to stop companies being able to collect data. Because we all have different personas. If you're Jane's mother and a governor at Jim's school, and you work in a bank, and these are areas of your life that you may choose to keep completely separate, and you ought to have the power to do that. Why not? It seems entirely reasonable, as long as you're not doing it for nefarious purposes. And there's the issue. There's the dilemma. How do we stop the bad guys doing that? And if we can't, does it matter?
A question in the middle. I think you've just hit one of the key points that's not addressed up here, and that's who wants that information. What would they do to get it, and what ways? So it's more than just what's on the IT, because Snowden is an insider.
Yep.
So no matter what anyone does to protect the data, if you've agreed it can be collected and used for this purpose, an insider could have their own justification. As long as they justify to themselves that it's right to do something else with that data, then you're in a very difficult position in time in trying to protect it.
If we were to decide as a society that we were going to protect that, then we're pretty good in the IT industry. We can crack that problem.
No, I disagree. Sorry, I disagree.
There's been I think a patent issued recently for processing encrypted data without decrypting it. The ability to do searches on encrypted data without decrypting it. That's a pretty strong protection against insiders using that data. So there are things that we can do, maybe not to eliminate problems. I don't think you're ever in the business of completely 100% guarantees for anything, but we can certainly reduce the attack surface in all sorts of ways.
If someone's an insider, they have access to the data.
But if it's encrypted, they can't do anything with it.
Well, to use it, they're decrypting it.
Not necessarily. That's the point I'm making. I mean, it's...
If it's on my screen, I could sit there with a camera and photograph it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so you could, yes, if you've got the legitimate access to it, then you could do it. But yeah, if you're the data owner, you're not going to give that key away unless you want them to have access
So
to
the
it.
national security letter in the US can require the turning over of the key.
Oh, absolutely. I'm clearly, the law can insist if you've got access to data, then with the appropriate legal warrants, they can insist on.
Or a hacker could take the key.
May be able to coerce you into doing it, or may be able to trick you into doing it. Yes,
How do you
those
attempt
things
to
are true.
decentralise it? Decentralise information stored in databases. After the DoD was leaked by Bernard Manning, but they've introduced new measures now protecting data, so it's not as simple as one person has a key so we can access all the data.
Yeah. Yeah, and ironically, Snowden tried very, very hard to persuade the NSA to change the monitoring and the access rules to data in order to prevent him from doing what he did. But they wouldn't listen, so he did what he did.
It's not questions about security, it's about data completion. If you have, say, Nectar, who have all this information on you, and then the NHS, which have all this different information on you, as you said, you wanted to affect a health policy. Surely a centralised, not in location, but in one giant database, if it's split up, so be it, but that's an issue of security, not completeness and safety of your online and offline profile. Which would you recommend? Would you have many separate databases all correlating to one person, or a complete database which can be used in a more effective way? And if later legislation came in that said, if you want to access this database for analysis, you then have to contribute back to the database the data the analysis that you've completed.
I think those alternative technical approaches to implementing a policy where what I'm really interested in is what's the policy that we're actually trying to achieve here. It's perfectly clear that the universe of technical approaches is very large indeed, and one of the consequences of the Snowden revelations is that it's kicked off an arms race between the security services and the geeks, because the geeks want their internet back, thank you very much, and the security services want to be able to keep penetrating it, and as a consequence there are some very, very serious brain cycles going into making it very, very much harder for the security services to do their job. Again, it's a social dilemma. Do we think that's a good thing or a bad thing? I'm up for hearing.
There's a question here, and then
well, I just think the genie's out of the bottle now. I think legislation is going to be very difficult, and I think as people try to subvert, the people in the know try to subvert the data sets by putting rubbish data in, like multiple personas, swapping SIM. You have swap SIM parties in the United States where people swap SIMs just to operate on a different SIM. And you have, I remember when loyalty cards, there was a backlash to supermarket loyalty cards. You go through the till and you buy lots of things and then hand it to the person behind you. So the little lady ends up with the condoms and the vodka. Just subvert the data. But I think
don't assume she can't use them.
But I think that the issue will be that eventually there will be legislation against that and possibly linked to identity cards. So to buy a mobile phone at some point in the future, you might need an identity card to validate the data stream that you're generating. That's an equal fear that I have.
Well, yeah, I mean the tightening up on buying pay-as-you-go SIMs is the law enforcement agencies have been working hard on that over many years because of the fact that they are used so widely by crooks. So I mean you're absolutely right, but to say the genie's out of the bottle is sort of saying even if we wanted to change anything, it's hopeless. So let's not worry about it. I don't want to give up that easily.
no, yes,
There's a lot of loose talk about the NHS. It's multiple organisations. There's a lot of physical, technical governance processes that have been traditionally very badly organised IT that blocks any
Privacy through incompetence, you think?
I mean, I work with the Welsh Government, I work in the NHS, I work design this for Wales, and I look after the information governance around it. We put a lot of snooping on our staff to check we're not doing funny behaviours. We have more firewalls that actually stop everything working than anyone can imagine. It's a closed system. Well, when we technically not it doesn't work. You know, it's a closed local area network around Wales. You know, you have to really be quite serious to be getting at NHS data. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you have to be pretty determined and know what you're doing in order to access it. The exceptions tend to be more government section 251s, things like that, where you can get big data extracts. The publicly available stuff, we wouldn't give the full postcode. So you think about, oh, we'll just give someone's postcode. We'd never do that.
No.
We would never give a postcode out because automatically you identify in rare diseases if you use more than the first three things. You know, it's kind of loose talk about something that's quite a rich system that traditionally has been very badly done, and equally the discussion doesn't seem to be balanced with the fact that your GP can see your record, your hospital consultant, and I'm one of them, can't see what you're allergic to when we prescribe your antibiotic. When you go out in and out as hours and unconscious, we have no idea what medication you're on unless it's tattooed or whatever. So the benefits of a closed system with multiple layers of governance with more blocks on everything you can imagine, and the data loss we suffer, it's not hackers, it's 400,000 emails which are misdirected. So we don't put PII on emails because there just is human error, and that's where we struggle, not with hackers and clever things and all the rest of it. And equally, somebody said about the Nectar points, I'll take the Nectar data, put it on the internal NHS network, and then we can do some work on it. But you ain't having the NHS data, no way. And if you do, it has to be demonstrably destroyed. We have to have evidence of destruction and an audit trail behind it, and all of that stuff. So a lot of it is physical, intellectual, technological, it's a mishmash of things to protect data, but use the data, because what I'm taking from this is, oh, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible, it's a risk, 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 risk. There is a safe way forward, you just have to be bloody careful, and you have to consult the public. We've been consulting the public on loads of issues. Some of it's leafleting, sometimes in the press, sometimes it's direct focus groups, you know, whatever it is. There's loads of mechanisms we do. So we've had a 7-year programme, and we were the first to get GP records into the out-of-hours GP. We haven't managed to get into casualty yet, because we haven't convinced GPC Wales, General Practitioners Wales, that that's okay, because the audit trails and the signing off that this access was okay. When you can't access the patient record unless the patient's on the system as sitting right in front of you, and you still have to sign the patient has given consent. And so you know, because the patient's sitting registered on that registry, that one. So we're using technical solutions as well to try and protect all of this. So it's not all bad, there's lots of benefits, and there are safe way forwards. You just have to be really, really careful.
Yeah, well, I hope I haven't been giving the impression that I don't think there are benefits, because I did try very hard to stress the fact that I think this is about dilemmas. I think that there are clear benefits and there are clear risks, and I don't suggest for a second that the NHS or indeed other companies don't do their best, well, don't do a lot of work to protect the data that they're handling. I know a fair amount about what the NHS in England does, because I got heavily involved with the Connecting for Health National Programme for IT and the Health Service stuff over a number of years. And I've been talking to the organisation that is newly responsible for this data, because Sir Ian Andrews, who was chairman of SOCA, is one of the non-executive directors. And it's clear that they don't yet have a coherent policy on anonymisation. They don't really understand yet the technical threats of de-anonymisation. And I would argue that this leaflet does not provide enough data for people to make an informed choice about whether they ought to opt out or not. And I think that's a real risk, because I think that the benefits of having that data available could very well be compromised by having some of the NGOs who are very active in the privacy area deciding to organise a major opt-out campaign. And you wouldn't need to get a very high proportion of the country opting out to make the whole system not work. And this is what happened with smart metering in the Netherlands, and completely destroyed the smart metering programs, that they had to go back and change the underlying legislation before starting rolling out smart electricity meters in the Netherlands because of a privacy campaign, because there hadn't been a properly informed debate. So that's what I really want to be stimulating here, to get this balance across, so that we can start trying to formulate how you take the decisions about the benefits of releasing data and the benefits of keeping it private, and what level of investment in technology society ought to be making in order to provide the technical structures that provide the appropriate balance between those things. So thank you for that contribution. It draws out again the importance of the benefit side of it, and the fact that there is real professional work going on in that area, yes.
My input goes as a cue to what gentleman spoke there. The entire discussion here is around the fact that we release the data and someone might misuse the data. And we call that as callous and ignorant in some of the ways. But say, for example, if I want to hide my location, I won't go check in on Foursquare that I'm somewhere. So as long as I do not provide the information, we are safe. So, and if we have the policy in place to monitor the misuse of data, we are in a pretty safe zone. So if I do not release the information that I do not want to be putting out on the internet, we are safe. And if there is a misuse, like my clicks being trailed out and stuff like that, as we are talking ahead, if there are enough policies to sue someone if they are misused, the entire process of using the data for better policy mechanism will work in our favor, not against us. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. So the thought of we releasing the data which is private to us, which we do not want people to know, is questionable, because I will not release the data that I do not want the world to know. So
do you take a conscious decision every time as to whether you're going to turn your phone on or off? Because all the time it's on, you're releasing where you are. You don't need to log into Foursquare to tell people where you are.
Yeah, so if there is, that is a point that I was making later, that if someone is misusing the data, so if Google is actually tracking where I am continuously, and without my consent gives it to someone, there needs to be a better policy. And if things work, we do not have to completely be against people using our data. So that is my take on that.
Yeah, I agree entirely, but the question is, what should that policy be, and how can we enforce it? Because I think there is a real difficulty, firstly, in deciding what general principles we want to apply. I mean, is the European Data Protection Directive adequate, for example? In its new form, should the UK be welcoming it, or should we continue to try and fight it in the way that is going on? I mean, there are some real issues here, as is evidenced by the fact that the UK chose not to implement the European Data Protection Directive fully, quite consciously, and has then built databases that violate at least the spirit, if not the letter, because it hasn't been to court yet, of the strict Data Protection Directive. So there is, if you like, evidence that we're not getting the policy right at the moment, because we're not drawing up clear principles and then implementing them coherently.
I was intrigued by the fact that the data masses, you can still de-anonymize that data and identify individuals within there. But I was thinking as well, a recent case was there's been examples of people, celebrities on Twitter putting something on and getting some deeply unpleasant responses. And in those cases, there didn't seem to be any means of tracking down people whose behaviour was, well, reprehensible at best and possibly a breach of some crime or other.
They can be tracked.
On just false names and false identity on
Yeah, I mean they can be tracked. It's a bit tricky. In order to do it, you need cooperation from the internet service provider who will be able to identify, given a time window, the origin of a particular data transmission. So you can track the transmissions back across the network. I mean, this is how the how CEOP, for example, tracks down paedophile activity. It takes a fair amount of resources and cooperation from the ISPs, but it is generally possible to do that. It's quite difficult to do it to really strong evidential standards because of actually a slightly arcane problem of timing differences. The fact that the clocks across the internet are not necessarily all completely synchronized with the right resolution. So you may find that because of the dynamic allocation of IP addresses, because we're running out of IP addresses and therefore the ISPs are reallocating IP addresses to people every time they log on to the network, it can be difficult to, even when you've identified the IP address that something's coming from, to actually tie it back to a physical device. But you know, these are problems that can be addressed and are for serious crime investigation.
In the middle and then at the back, I think one of the challenges you'll have in defining policy of what is allowable to be done with big data is going to be that the people who see a benefit in using the data are always going to be pushing the envelope right to the boundary. And so, as you've said, if we're trying to define general principles, there will be people and organisations that will try and push that a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. And I think that's going to be one of the hardest things to really pin down, particularly on a global scale. Because I agree with someone who said that the most big business is global, it's international, and it will operate from wherever it is most conducive for it to work.
Yes, that's absolutely true. It's interesting. I mean, the Americans managed to exercise their laws outside America, as you can see in the way that, for example, they fine major banks that are not based in America. There are ways in which it's possible, if you are big enough, to exercise that, and Europe is big enough and the UK isn't. So these things would need to be done at a Europe level, I think, and then you've got enough weight to be able to legislate and enforce it. And to a degree, you know, the safe harbour rules and so on for data are part of that process in action, although they're not anything like strong enough. So I don't think it's hopeless. I think, you know, it is possible to engage and enforce those rules. And I take some heart from the current wave of compensation for the mis-selling of things like PPI, where you've got companies that were pushing things to the limit, and then suddenly you get hit by effectively a class action that causes billions of pounds of losses to the organisations that were doing stuff that is then deemed to be just over the boundary of what ought to be allowed. And I wonder whether some of the claims about the way that data is handling is in a sense another mis-selling scandal, and that maybe the organisations that are doing it will get hit by major compensation claims, and that will cause a pullback and a change of behaviour. I don't know.
I believe I'm right in saying the EU is drafting a new law, a new wonder how possible, and if you know anything about it, if you could say more, and how possible and practical that would actually be.
I mean, Google does actually claim that it will delete all your data if you ask it to. And if you know how to do it, you can log on to your Google account and look at all the data that Google holds about you and delete it. And if you believe them, then it's gone. There may be another copy down the road at the NSA, of course, but one of these days they'll go into business and provide online backups for all of us, and then at least we'll be getting some benefit out of all our data that they're collecting. I look forward to the day somebody loses all their family photographs and sues the NSA to get them back. I mean, that will be wonderful. I encourage you to do it if you're in that position. The problem with the right to be forgotten is that you can only apply it to the sort of primary keeper of the data. And if, for example, you've posted a picture on Facebook that you'd really like to be forgotten, how many copies of that are there around the place? My son was impersonated by some guy in Italy who was using the online photograph that he'd put on his website to identify himself as the imposter, because it looked sufficiently handsome that it was working well in chatting up women. And so my son used one of the search engines that enables you to put in a photograph and look for other copies of that photograph around the internet to find as many places as he could where this was being done, and then went to the organisations hosting those websites and complained, and did finally get the guy to back off and start using somebody else's photograph instead. But you know, it's a lot of work, and you need to know how to use the tools that are available. It's certainly not a panacea, this right to be forgotten.
Do you know why the government have chosen not to implement more serious penalties for data protection?
I don't know. I suspect that it is commercial pressures. I think that it was. I would guess that it was as a result of a consultation where there was sufficient argument put forward that actually it would have commercially damaging effects, that it was chosen not to do so. But I honestly don't know.
Well, we seem in this country to be in a peculiarly bad position. I mean, you know, I'd hope that the government on that cases was kind of on my side as a citizen and willing to protect my privacy against these people, but also it kind of ties in with the attitude of the British government to the Snowden revelations, where they've said, oh, let's sue the Guardian, while everybody else says, let's have a discussion about this.
Yeah, I mean, the government has a long history of wanting to know an awful lot about people and to have centralised information and centralised control. I mean, Home Office has been trying to introduce ID cards ever since ID cards were abolished at the end of the Second World War. And they've been reintroduced by successive Home Office ministers and pushed aside over numbers of governments of different political persuasions. It's not a party political thing. It's clearly just in the DNA of the Home Office to want that level of knowledge about citizens. I think they must be frightened of us.
Is, in your opinion, I mean, it seems we're doing many things wrong, and that much has become apparent really from the Snowden debate and various other things that have been in the news over the last few years. But is anyone doing this right in Europe or around the world? Who do you think is leading in this area of protection of individual information?
I'm not really enough of an expert on the international